her own words, this evening's speaker cautions against conservation efforts that aim at a perfect restoration to an Edenic baseline that would always conserve all the correct species, all the natural interactions between them, all the ecosystem services that the land provided, and all the beauty that time and chance or God had put in place. Emma Marris is author of the critically acclaimed book Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World, which is essential reading for anyone who cares about the environment. Emma makes a case for shifting our focus from trying to recreate or return to a lost primeval Edenic state in nature to envisioning a new Eden. She points out that as humans change every centimeter of the earth, from what species live where to its very climate, our strategies for saving nature must change. Her book explains why, and more importantly, how. Why, and more importantly, how. Working as a freelance writer, formerly based in Columbia, Missouri, Emma has written for Conservation, Slate, Nature Medicine, On Earth, and Nature on topics ranging from the environment, evolution, energy, agriculture, and food to language, books, and film. Please join me in welcoming Emma Marris.
Hello, and thank you so much, Annette and Naomi, for inviting me to this fascinating, wonderful conference, which I'm learning so much and getting so itchy to go home and plant a garden. So I'm going to talk a little bit about whether or not the world is a garden. And I'm going to start with the Garden of Eden, which I think is an image that's often raised in environmental circles, but it can be very confusing because on the one hand, it's the sort of perfect pre-fallen state, and there's definitely a narrative of the fall in the environmental world. It's lush, it's vibrant, it's biodiverse, but it's a garden. And in North American conservation and conservation biology, which is the group of people that I spent most of my time studying and reporting on, the garden is not the ideal state. The ideal state is the wilderness. The wilderness is defined mostly just by the fact that there aren't any people in it, and that it's not managed or organized by people. So there it is. Somehow we kind of mush these narratives together, that there was a perfect green place that we lost, but it wasn't a garden, it was a wilderness. It's the anti-garden. So in both the popular mind and in the law, the Wilderness Act of 1964, wilderness has two main properties. One is that it's, and I've added the bolding and underlining here, one is that it is primeval, that it is somehow unchanged from the past. And the other one is that it is not meddled with, that it is unmanaged today. So a true wilderness is both unchanged and unmanaged. The problem with that is you can't actually have both at the same time in 2013. Pristine wilderness is pretty much an empty category. If it looks like it used to, that means somebody's managing it. And if it's unmanaged, it looks unfamiliar. Part of the reason that I started working on this is I read this book, maybe a lot of you have also read Charles Mann's 1491, talking about all of the changes to North America before Europeans got here. So when Europeans first got here, they hopped off the boat and they thought they were looking at a virgin wilderness. And until quite recently, everybody else more or less unconsciously agreed with them. There was this really kind of unpleasant idea that the people who lived here before were just so ineffectual that they couldn't have done anything really massive to the landscape. But now we're beginning to realize, it's beginning to finally sink in that the place that people saw when they first came to North America was in fact a completely humanized landscape. People who lived here before had massive cities, large-scale agriculture, and very intensive land management practices, including hunting rules, no-take zones, burning, and planting. I love the title of this book, Tending the Wild, because many of the places that we think of as the most wild were places that were actively managed by people before Europeans got here. And then if you go even further back in time, say 13,000 years ago, what you see in the record is a suite of extinctions of massive animals in North America, including mastodons, mammoths, giant ground sloths, and various other enormous creatures. And when these extinctions took place, not only did these animals just disappear, but all the other ecosystems of North America rearranged. There were ripple effects that went through them. Things that had been grasslands became forested. Forest types shifted. The dominant trees swapped around. All of this we can see in sort of interesting detail by looking at pollen records. And these initial extinctions were probably kicked off, at least in large part, by human hunting. So I started, when I was writing for Nature and following ecology and conservation biology, reading these studies, I started this quest for the perfect day. What was the place we're supposed to go back to in North America? If we restore, what are we restoring to? What's that day before we messed it up? And the more I learned about pre-European peoples and how they managed the land, I realized we had to push that day back, and then I learned about these massive extinctions 13,000 years ago, so you have to push I said, okay, well, what about the day before people even got to North America? But this is what it looked like on that day. The ice hadn't even fully begun to retreat before the first people hopped onto the continent. So if you really want to go back to the day before people, you end up with, in a lot of parts of the country, ice. And I don't think ice is a good conservation goal for most areas. So this really kind of blew my mind, and I think that it has sort of slowly been blowing the minds of a lot of conservation biologists and ecologists for the past 10 or so years as we kind of grapple with this and what this means for what we're doing as conservationists. The other thing to keep in mind is that even if we had some very sophisticated understanding of ecosystems such that we could somehow model them and magically erase humans and see how they would have changed over time without us, it wouldn't be the same as it was the day before people, because ecosystems change on their own all the time. Despite the sort of common Disney notion of the balance of nature and the timeless forests, there probably aren't very many ecosystems that look the same for even 1,000 years. Let alone millennia. In fact, there's one, Stephen Jackson has done one kind of massive study where he decided that the very longest ecosystem in North America that persisted without any major changes was 12,000 years. Everything else has had a shorter lifespan as an ecosystem. So that means that what we would have had to restore to would be this unknowable alternative reality in which humans never came here. And then there are other changes too. I mean, we've changed the very plants and animals that are here. We haven't just subtracted, we've also added. And we didn't just bring plants from other continents, we kind of made whole plants up, so to speak, by doing massive domestication and breeding projects. And this isn't just North America, this is around the whole world. Extinctions, introductions, movements, land use change. We've been fiddling around for a long time, and what we've got is a lot different than it used to be. And now we have, this is one of my favorite examples. This is the moa. To me, the moa is sort of the hinge point between the prehistoric extinctions and the modern extinctions, because in New Zealand, there weren't any people until less than 1,000 years ago. They showed up, they found this bird, it was dumb, it was tasty, and it was gone in like 2 generations. And that was sort of the last of the extinctions where it was a new person coming, people coming to a new landmass, but it was also within historical recorded history, so it was sort of the first of the modern, oops, we accidentally drove this species extinct extinctions. And now we're dealing with climate change, and climate change is sort of the ultimate end of the discussion of anything being pristine, because even places where humanity has never set foot, there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the temperature and climate is different. This is just the carbon dioxide record over the years from the atmospheric science installation in Hawaii that's been measuring it the longest. So we just can't go back because there's no sensible place to go back to. So what do? The old goal was so handy and neat. Everything was right back then. And any goal that we might have, ecosystem services or beauty or biodiversity was always best served by just putting it back the way it used to be. So it was very easy, kind of conceptually. But now we have to figure out what our goals are for every site, and then figure out how best to work forward to those goals in an uncertain and changing world, given our limited knowledge. And you can see why we kind of don't want to hear this message, because it's just a lot harder sounding and a lot more complicated than just, we broke it, let's put it back. But on the other hand, we're sort of already doing this, because there are very few places where people have the money and the resources to put things back exactly the way they were. Pragmatism really does rule the day in restoration projects and landscape projects. You kind of do what you can do. Now, this is the image that finally completely broke my sense that we could put things back. I was in a Society for Conservation Biology meeting in South Africa, and there was a talk about elephants. And all I knew about elephants is what I'd seen on nature documentaries. And that was filled with these helicopter tracking shots where they would go over the top of this massive herd of elephants, stampeding across these vast open spaces, and they would talk about their long-distance migrations. And they just looked like there was all this space. And then when I was at the meeting, they put up this map, which is this is where elephants are in Africa. And it shouldn't have come as a surprise to me, because Africa is full of people and cities and roads, and yet there's been this kind of vision sold to us that Africa is just one big expanse of elephant habitat. And when I saw this, I realized that there was no going back. You can't stitch everything, remove people from this equation. This is already where the elephants are, and it looks like little sprinkles on the map. So, what I've noticed is that the work of trying to make things look pristine is getting more and more like gardening all the time. It used to be that all you basically had to do was stop people from fiddling with it, put up a fence or a wall, and don't let people in, and then it will more or less look the way that it used to. But with the scale of land use change, climate change, species moving around, it now requires ever more active fiddling in order to make it look unfiddled with. So my favorite example of this is Yellowstone, because I think that for many people in North America, Yellowstone is kind of an emblem of the wildest place. And here in Yellowstone, they are weeding their fish. They're catching all the fish they can and taking out all the invasive, I'm going to use the word invasive because that's what they use, all the invasive trout, and then throwing back all the good trout. And so this is a major operation that they do every year to try to keep the right kind of trout there. And then here's an example of some of the other things that they do. They pull weeds. I have a note here from their last invasive species report. Invasive Vegetation Management Plan from February. So by 2010, about 70 park staff and 100 volunteers were involved in invasive plant control, covering about 20,000 acres. About 4,600 acres were found to have non-native vegetation, 105 acres were treated, 9 acres twice, and by 2011, permanent and seasonal resource management operation staff were spending 36% of their work hours on non-native plant management, with most of that time used to pull or spray weeds. So, a lot of weeding. They're hazing and culling bison to keep them where they are. They have goals for exactly how many animals they want, of which gender, or sex, I guess they say for animals, at the end of every winter. They vaccinate the bison. They suppress wildfires. They reduce fuel loads. Here's a little note from their hazard fuels management guidelines. Initially, following treatment, a developed area will appear more groomed, with the trees being more uniformly spaced. However, over time, wind throw, regeneration, and the accumulation of other forest debris will result in a less managed appearance. So, first they weed the trees, and then they just wait for it to get that nice natural look again. And now, with climate change really hammering the white bark pine up at the higher elevations, and the beetles going after the pines in a major way, there is an effort to breed individual pines that are resistant to the beetles. They've found pines that have good resistance, they're breeding them in gardens, and they're very seriously discussing going out and planting them. So this would be the final step. If when you're actually breeding and planting species for Yellowstone, it's hard to see this as a wild, unmanaged place at that point. Here's a couple other just examples. The frog here is a yellow-legged frog from California, which was susceptible to fungus. So conservation biologists go out and they get this great microbe, this little bacteria that's found to fend off the fungus, and they paint it individually onto the backs of each frog. Here's the California condor, which has been reintroduced with the help of breeding programs and puppets looking like mama condors so that they can raise two clutches of chicks from each female condor. One is raised by mama and the other one's raised by the latex puppet. And down below is the peregrine falcon, which was a great successful reintroduction story, which they were only able to reintroduce by bringing together 3 or 4 different subspecies of falcon and breeding them together so they had enough genetic diversity to make a go of it. So these are the ways in which modern conservation is operating. It's not about putting up a fence and stopping people from fiddling with it. It's about fiddling with it. This is the chestnuts that they're breeding, the American chestnuts. They're trying to get genetic engineered chestnuts out in the forests to replace the ones that have all been knocked back by blight. So all of that is sort of what I would consider to be gardening for the pristine look. But what I'm more interested in is, okay, forget the pristine look. This has become a distraction. Let's garden for things that really matter to us, like diversity, beauty, services, and to stop extinctions. This is a guy, Frans Vera, in the Netherlands, who has put together a totally fascinating nature reserve where he is using proxy animals to take the place of extinct European species that he thinks were the main ecosystem drivers in Europe. So there's this big debate about whether pre-human Europe was a big, huge forest like out of the Grimm's fairy tales, or, in his opinion, a big savanna dominated by big herds of wild horses and auroch. So he's in the savanna camp, and in order to sort of prove his thesis, he's kind of put together a Pleistocene savanna in the Netherlands. So behind him there you can see some of his herds of horses. They're not wild horses, they're extinct, but they're a Polish breed that seemed pretty close. And here are his auroch. Obviously they're not aurochs, because aurochs, the last aurochs were shot in Poland in the 1600s, but these are a line of cattle that have been bred to resemble aurochs. So he's not as concerned here about getting the details right. He wants the exciting functions and the exciting wild beauty of nature back. You can kind of see in the image in the back some of the pylons and stuff. This is about half an hour from Amsterdam, and it's 15 feet below sea level. So I like to think of this as a garden about wilderness. But then what happens to real wilderness? Is there such a thing anymore in this gardened world? And I think there is, but I think that it's not Yellowstone. I think it's this. And this is in Hawaii. It's a jungle that nobody's really paid much attention to. It's kind of behind, off the road somewhere. And it's what ecologists are starting to call a novel ecosystem. There's almost no native plants in this scene. Everything is from Brazil or Mexico or Australia or South America, Southeast Asia. It's totally cosmopolitan. It's kind of like Heathrow Airport. But what's interesting is that our common kind of vision of non-natives is that they show up and they're totally aggressive and they form this monoculture and everything is smothered in their path. But what these non-natives are doing is they're kind of playing house in this very amenable way. They're creating relationships with one another. They're living on one another physically. They're starting kind of the bare beginnings of mutualisms with insects and birds, and non-native birds are pollinating and seed dispersing native plants. So what's interesting is that if you were an ecologist from Mars, or even just a temperate ecologist, didn't know that much about tropical plants, and you were dropped into this scene, it'd be very difficult for you to identify this as a novel ecosystem, because it just kind of looks like an ecosystem. And the grad student, Joe Mascaro, who has been studying these, has been measuring all these kinds of things about it, like leaf litter soil formation, nutrient cycling, carbon dioxide sequestration, and it pretty much beats most native Hawaiian forests in many of these functions. including diversity. There are, in fact, in some novel ecosystems, quite a few more species of plants and animals than in corresponding native forests. But what I like about them is not that they're, this is a Cecropia on an old Hawaiian rock wall. So there's a little bit of the human past there. Not only did we bring these species there, but they're actually growing on our previous attempts at dominating the landscape. What I like about these places is not so much that they do these ecosystem-y things, it's that they're doing them without us fiddling with it. Like there's no guy there pulling them out or adding to them or deciding what should be planted. There's no guy, and there's no one fighting over these areas because they're considered to be weedy, trashy areas. So they really are self-willed in a way that, say, Yellowstone is no longer self-willed. Yellowstone is now guided by us, but these places, although set into motion by our activities, are in fact guiding themselves. So I think this is the wilderness we've got now. I added this one in the response to our lunchtime talk, which had a lot of beautiful pictures of ecosystems hanging out in old cars. This is also in Hawaii, and this is some non-native orchids that are enjoying this place. But I sometimes use this slide when I talk about one feature about novel ecosystems is that there aren't a bunch of like 80-year-old guys with white beards and PhDs telling people how to run them. They're kind of democratic spaces in a way, and people who are local, or the people who really pay attention to these spaces are people who hunt feral pigs, teenagers who want to drink beer, people without permanent addresses who want some place to hang out in at night. They're much more democratic spaces, I think, than these sort of intensively managed jewel-like national parks. And this one is a great sort of philosophical puzzle about whether or not these guys are invasive, because this is brand new land. This lava flow flowed out in the 1960s, and these are the first 3 plants to colonize brand new land that didn't exist. And it's the ohia is native, the sword fern is from Southeast Asia, and the ironwood is from Australia. So it'll be really interesting to see what kind of ecosystem develops here. But it's also interesting to consider whether or not you could call these guys non-native, given that there was no native flora before. They're the first people on new land, the first species on new land. So I like just leaving novel ecosystems alone and sort of respecting their wildness. But another way to work with them is given in this example from the Seychelles, where this is mostly cinnamon. So there was a cinnamon forestry. Cinnamon did really well there. Pretty soon, practically the whole island is cinnamon, and there's not a lot of room for the natives. So the first thing they tried is just they yanked out all the cinnamon, and what happened was a bunch of other non-natives sprung up that were even harder to get rid of and nastier. The nice thing about the cinnamon is that the native birds can hang out there and eat their fruits, and they make good shade. So instead of just yanking it out, they decided to compromise. They get these native plants, and they carve out little rooms within the matrix of the cinnamon, and they plant them there, kind of like little hair plugs. And they hope that this will be a sort of a compromise, that both kinds of ecosystems can have their homes here. Another way that you can fiddle in a way that isn't about putting things back the way it used to be is assisted migration, or moving things to help them survive the ravages of climate change. This is a pika, an adorable little relative of a rabbit that grows in the, too much time at the garden conference, that lives in the Rocky Mountains, but it's very threatened by, it cannot handle heat. There was some probably unethical experiments done in the 1970s in which they were subjected to various temperatures, and they really just expire after, I think it's about 70 degrees, they just croak. So if you want this guy to survive, you may have to take it on, it can't go down from its mountaintop and walk across the plain and go up the next mountain to the north, because it'll just die in the middle. So you have to put it in a little cooler and drive it to the next mountain to the north, and hope that it will survive there. So that's assisted migration in a nutshell. And it's being proposed not only for animal species, but also for plants. This is a Gary oak system, very beautiful garden-like system that you see along California and Washington and into British Columbia. And they're interested in moving it north up Vancouver Island. So it'll have room to persist, essentially, as the climate changes. And I went out with a scientist who was studying all the components of this ecosystem that she could name, not just the oaks and the various little flowers that grow underneath, but also the butterflies that need the flowers that grow underneath for their life cycle, and trying to figure out, could you move them all at once? Would they all survive the trip? And how far would you move them? And would you move the ones from the north end of the range or from the middle of the range? And so one thing that's interesting about this is that I really see the native gardening movement starting to get into this in a major way in the future. If you have a native garden, you can also sort of be looking around, okay, so what are some native species from just to the south of me that need help, that are in trouble, that are not handling climate change well? I can bring them to my garden. They're sort of like neighbor natives. Maybe they weren't officially native to my state or my county, but maybe I can help them move in. All of this sort of meddling for the intervention for the future requires a certain aesthetic shift. A lot of us, especially in the environmental movement, have been trained to only find things pleasing or beautiful if they're in the right place. Stuart Pym, famous conservationist who's done a lot of good, once told me that he finds this plant, the Brazilian pepper, to be beautiful in Brazil and ugly in Florida, because it belongs in Brazil, and in Florida it's a sort of despised invasive. But I can't help but find it beautiful in Florida too. I mean, it may be problematic, but it's still beautiful. And it's not the plant's fault, it's our fault for moving it around. So this is, I think, the way that many people kind of divide up the earth when they think about what things are. They think that there are some areas that look like they used to and some areas that look new. And there are some areas that are managed and some areas that are unmanaged. And I think that your man on the street basically thinks that a place like Yellowstone is unmanaged and looks like it used to. And a place like Central Park or your backyard is changed and managed. And places that are unmanaged and look new, those are bad. That's like the weedy, empty lot in your neighborhood. That's not a good outcome. If things look new, you want them to be organized. And what they don't see as a potential space is the idea that something looks like it used to and is managed. That kind of management has largely been invisible to the sort of man on the street. So this is the way that I see us going forward thinking about these spaces. The things that are managed and look like they used to are going to be smaller and smaller and more expensive. They will be more like museums or teaching kind of laboratories than they will be very, very large landscapes. Things that are managed and changed will be the majority of the planet. I hope that we can move from an unconscious gardening to a conscious gardening of many of these spaces. But a lot of them is going to be agricultural fields and developed areas, because that's already a huge percentage of the Earth's surface. And then you're going to have the things that look new and that are not managed. These will be these novel systems, like the ones I showed you in Hawaii, the Seychelles. And I'm sure that if you just pull off to the side of the road anywhere near your house and walk a few feet into somebody's not very well tended piece of land, or go out behind the Target, or just look in the culvert, you can find your own novel ecosystem within a 5-mile drive from your house, or probably a mile drive. And finally, the category of things that look the same and are not managed, that category, I would argue, is already extinct. That's not going to be a viable category. So I just want to address the temptation to withdraw. When we hear about horrible environmental problems, especially things that just seem so overwhelming, such as climate change, there is a group of people who sort of say, okay, the only moral thing to do here is just to withdraw and to say, I'm not going to be part of the problem. I'm just going to go off and live in a cabin somewhere and grow my own food, and I'm not going to engage with this huge beast that humanity has become. And I can see that impulse. I think it's very understandable in the face of these overwhelming issues. But I also think it's cowardly. I think that not intervening is no longer an option. At any given site, if we walk away or we decide not to mess with that site, then we'll just let the sort of larger tide of anthropogenic forces wash over it without any buffering. there's already a large category of species which could be described as conservation reliant, meaning that if we turned off our support for them tomorrow, they would go extinct. They now need us to hold their hands, at least for the foreseeable future. So not intervening is not an option. Pretending not to intervene, withdrawing, is not a moral option. The Earth is now our responsibility. That doesn't mean that we have to intensively manage everywhere. In fact, I counsel against it. I think letting nature show us how to adapt to a changing planet is the wiser course. But we have to keep an eye on it. We have to intervene where necessary to prevent extinctions, in my opinion. This is the conservation policy equivalent of withdrawing, putting a big fence around it and not allowing people in. And again, very tempting because people do tend to screw things up. But I think that if we have too many spaces like this, we risk really turning off all future generations from being interested in plants and animals other than a small short list of those that are, that we're familiar with, like dogs and cats and wheat. If we want to get people interested in the whole, full extent of Earth's biodiversity, then we need to let them experience it. And we can't just look at it with our hands in our pockets. We have to let people actually touch it and engage with it. And that's sort of why I like gardening as a metaphor for how we should take care of the earth, because although stewardship, which is the classic metaphor, does imply a very sort of nice role where you tend for something that is not yours, it could just be some guy at a bank with the keys to the strong box, or the keys to some butler with the keys to the wine cellar. The gardener, on the other hand, actually has a physical touching on your knees, hands in the dirt relationship with the plants and animals under his or her care. And I think that I'm trying not to use the word nature. That's why I'm stumbling. And so I think that might be the better course. And I also think it's the more realistic course, because I think that we have this very obvious instinct to touch nature and to meddle with it. We do it to survive when we create agriculture, and we do it to carve out homes for ourselves, but we also do it out of the pure love of doing it, out of just making our mark on the world and experiencing its beauty by engaging with it. I was hiking in the Rockies in the wilderness, and I found this little artifact. And what I thought was interesting about it is that almost certainly the person who made it was drawn to that particular hike or that area because it was wilderness, because it was nature, because there weren't other people in it. And yet even they could not stop themselves from organizing it and fiddling with it to a certain extent and trying to participate in the beauty there. So I think that our gardening impulse, it's better to harness it than to try to shut it off. When I was writing my book, I started out being saddened by the fact that pristine wilderness was a myth and that we could not go back. But I had a kind of a gestalt shift some way through that got me very excited and made me very happy. My faces became a vase, or my vase became faces. This is the designated wilderness in the United States of America. And if this is it, if this is all we're fighting over, if this is all that is nature, then that's, gosh. Yeah, they just released a new season of my favorite mystery show, and maybe I'll just go get that on Netflix. But this is a map of the permeability. The impermeable surfaces are the white, and the somewhat permeable surfaces are the gray, and the totally permeable surfaces are the black. And this is the map, I think, that shows us where we can garden. And that black is a lot bigger than that beige. So that was my shift, going from seeing only the wilderness as the nature that we can care about and that we can foster, to seeing everything that isn't a hunk of concrete as a place where we can do good work and improve things. So what should we do in our own lives? Well, the first thing that I did was I tried to get off the trail a little more and not fetishize nature as this place that I was unworthy to touch. So this is my kids. Recently we were at just a state park in Missouri, and I dragged them off the trail, and we climbed up this rock, which turned out to have a gazillion snails on the top. Probably they congregate on the top of small rises in order to mate, because geometrically they're more likely to run into each other in a smaller area. I know butterflies do that, so that's my guess. But my husband was kind of freaking, are you sure we're supposed to be off the trail? And, could we get in trouble for this? And And at the end of our little day in the park, we actually looked up the regulations, and sure enough, it was completely okay to go off the trail and to do whatever you want. It's a state park, but people don't do it because they're trained to stay on the path. But if you stay on the path, you can't pick up walnut shells and dig around with a little stick, and you can't do what we ended up doing and actually take home some of the snail shells. Don't tell the Missouri State Park System. You have to be able to touch it and engage with it physically with your hands, I think, in order to care about it, especially if you're a kid. I can't tell you how many times I've dragged her down the path. Kids hate walking just in a straight line for an hour anyway. What they really want to do is fiddle around and collect things and put them in their pockets, and this is the way to get them to care. Now, in your garden, what can you do? Well, you can, this is a rain garden in Seattle where when she's done is not gardened as if she has just a blank piece of paper, but gardens in a way that there's a relationship with the hydrology in her neighborhood. So that's one thing that's fun. You can do a native garden. This is from the University of Delaware native garden that I pulled off the website. And you can do, as I suggested earlier, and add to your native garden some of these natives from a couple of a zone or two south of you. Or you can get together with your neighbors and start trying to do things on sort of a meta-population or corridor-like level. This is a cool project in Seattle called The Path of the Pollinator, where they've taken these, we call them parking strips, I'm told you call them medians, the area between the sidewalk and the road, and everybody along the whole block, all the way connecting these two widely separated parks, agrees to plant these species that are attractive to pollinators, so it makes like a little road for the pollinators to go back and forth between the two park areas. And I love this project because it's pretty low investment. It's just your parking strip, not your whole yard, and it gets you talking to your neighbors. You're in a collective enterprise together, and it leverages your tiny amount of space for a greater project. So by the time I got done writing the book and looking at all of these ways that we could intervene or strategically not intervene in order to actually improve things, right? Make things more diverse, make there be more plants and animals in our immediate neighborhoods or around the world, the more excited I got, and the more I began to think, well, maybe I am a little utopian. Maybe a garden is a good metaphor. Maybe wilderness isn't the goal. Maybe it's a garden that we can share and just lounge around naked with lions and turkeys and camels, and I think we could all have a wonderful time. So thanks so much.
I can't believe it's over. It was over way too soon.
Oh my
No,
gosh, I was
I'm
fast.
kidding. I'm not really kidding. I would sit here for another hour easily. Emma, would you be, Emma would be happy to take some questions for maybe 5-10 minutes or so, and then I'd like to invite everyone out to a closing reception for the evening. And the idea of the reception was really to a means to carry on the conversation. That is, I hope Emma will, she'll be here and would love to talk to you, and for all of us an opportunity to further exchange ideas and also unwind from this long day. So,
All right. Yes?
Outside of Austin, Texas, you can go visit the J Ranch
Yeah.
along the Dallas River, where it's what you would call an environmental museum or an ecological museum. The cattle that he raised there, they're way too fat now. They would never be sold on the market. So, but they keep them just the way he raised them. That's how he would have wanted them.
Yeah, that's interesting.
His cattle are classy.
Well, I like that approach because I think that there is, if we're going to pick a date to restore to, or to like have as our baseline, then why be boring and all pick the same date? Why do we all have to go for the day before the first European came? We could pick all sorts of different dates from different parts of our relationship with the land and hearken back to them. So there's a prairie restoration project in northern Montana that's an interesting private project run by the American Prairie Foundation. A guy named Sean Garrity kind of runs it. He used to be sort of a .com guy. And their touchstone is Lewis and Clark. They want to make it look like it did when Lewis and Clark was there. And I said, well, I was kind of thinking that I had one up on him, like, hey, you know, that's not pristine. That's not the way it was before. That's totally like a humanized landscape. And he was like, oh, I know, we just think the Indians managed it better. So we just want to go back to the way they were doing it. And I was like, oh, well, that sounds pretty cool. More power to you. And Peter Vitusek, who's an ecologist in Hawaii, sketched out to me one day when we were just chatting at a conference this vision that he has for a series of parks in Hawaii, each one of which would start at the top of the mountain and go all the way down to the surf. So they'd be like slices of a pie. And each one would be pre-human, and one would be pre-European, and one would be early European. So you'd have one that was just all totally native and like it was before anyone showed up, and then you'd have one that would include the way that the land was intensively managed by the Polynesians who showed up in their boats with their own plants and animals in tow. And then you'd have one that that kind of recreated the way that it looked in the sort of cattle ranching and, you know, early farming days. So I love that idea. Yeah, I think it's cool. Yes.
I found out somewhat to my surprise that in Hawaii, which I haven't been since I served, God knows when, that the pineapple business is gone, the sugar business is gone. It seems a lot of what the endless expanse of dull fields is gone. It's just cattle ranch. What is happening there with the land in Hawaii that seems to have gone out of the businesses that were there when we do?
I don't know if I can answer your question in good detail. I don't have good data at my fingertips. I mean, I do know that there are there's a lot of efforts to try to buy up land for kind of parks and restoration. But how that land is going to be managed is going to be interesting to see. In my book, I talk about this project where in the sort of lowland forest and the wet side of the Big Island, they tried to get these little plots and pull out every single non-native species so they could do a total native restoration. And it took them like, I don't know, 1,000 man-hours to do an area about the size of one of these banks of seats. And they had to keep going in and weeding it. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I went to the plot, and it looked like, I don't know what it looked like, kind of like a Japanese Zen garden. It was mostly lava. There were a couple of little scraggly-looking natives that had been kind of smushed under the vegetation and were sort of looking around like, what happened? We got the place back. And so, yeah, I know that the land use is in flux there, but there's so much touristic development as well and building of new houses. And so there's a lot going on. That's a great question. If I was king of Yellowstone, I think that, you know, Yellowstone is an important cultural landscape, and I think that a lot of what they're doing, it probably makes sense from a cultural perspective. I think the immediate change that I would make is in how it's communicated to the public. I think that while the managers and scientists there would probably disagree with me and probably say, well, we've got 1 million signs and placards about what we're doing, I think that the overall impression to the tourist that visits is that nothing is done, that it kind of runs itself in this balance of nature kind of way. So I think the first thing I would do is whack up a bunch of huge signs explaining all of the work that they're doing, and maybe trying to get tourists who come in to participate in the work or observe it. You know, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I would change all of that intervention, because it is a landscape that is important to our sense of identity as North Americans, and so maybe there's a reason to keep doing it. Now, would you do it for every park in the national park system? I think that, you know, spreading the resources that thin would mean that you would basically fail in all of them. I think you have to concentrate your resources to do something that aggressively intensive in just a couple of parks. But Yellowstone might be one of the ones I would do it in. But maybe some of the other parks around there, you have to let them change a bit. And even in Yellowstone, there's going to be a point as climate change unfolds where you're going to have to say, okay, if we keep pulling this back to our, 1858 baseline, then one day there's going to be a drought and it's going to break it in two. We have to let it change its composition so that it's got some sort of flexibility, some sort of buffer to climate change. The more you kind of restrain it, the more fragile you could make it as the conditions change. Does that make sense? Yes?
I love the way your talk asks you to imagine alternatives. But in your talk, I noticed that you never mentioned farming. So
Yeah.
let's assume that we all become vegetarians. We're not talking about meat farming.
Okay.
We're talking about cultivation of a variety of foodstuffs and possibly getting rid of all these monocultures. So do you foresee or can you imagine modes of farming that integrate food production with some of these ideas about the garden?
This is an excellent question.
Doesn't this map have to, this black part of
Yeah.
the map, don't these all have to be
They have farms on them now, yeah.
farmed, food-producing parts?
Yeah. And that's, good, well spotted that I didn't really talk about agriculture. And a lot of my book, too, is focused on what to do with places that are currently protected areas, places that are post-industrial landscapes, places that are empty lots. But yeah, farms are, I think there's 75% of the ice-free land on the earth is under agricultural use. So you have to figure out what to do about farms. The thing is like, I kind of can't make up my mind between making these really intensive factory-style farms that have genetically modified plants and are run with like precision satellite technology so that you can have more land left over for all the other gazillion species, or whether it would be better to have this more kind of biodiverse farming where you don't have monocultures, you have lots of different kinds of species, you do the very careful, you use techniques like permaculture, you have lots of big hedgerows full of butterflies. And I think the answer probably is a combination of the two, depending on where you are in the world and what your population is like and the economics. But I'm still figuring that one out, and it's I guess it's a wicked problem, right? I don't think that there's one right answer. I would like the right answer to be all those pretty biodiverse farms with all of the diversity on farm. But I'm not sure that the numbers work. With 9 billion people. I think that you might have to have some of these insane, really high-yielding producing farms in order to feed everybody. And not just to feed everybody on, corn. A lot of times when people do this, they do the math with just calories, like everybody needs a certain number of calories in the world. But that's not really equitable. I think that everybody also deserves tomatoes and leafy greens, and maybe some fish. Like, it's not good nutritionally or for the soul to subsist on nothing but cassava your whole life. So I think that an ideal solution not only has to have enough calories for everyone, it has to have good food for everyone. And that might mean, some really intensive farming. But I'm looking into that actively now. The science on that is developing. Yeah. Oh, great. So he asked about bringing back extinct species. I'm torn about that one too, and I'm sure you guys will agree with me that it just sounds so awesome, right? Like, not only does it just have this sort of geeky appeal, but it also gives us this yeah, we totally screwed up, but we can redeem ourselves. We can bring the passenger pigeon back, and we can bring back, so it's super appealing from that point of view. And Stuart Brand, who's been running the passenger pigeon project, his argument is that it would give people the optimism and enthusiasm to bring them back on board on the grander environmental conservation project. So if there isn't, I don't think, gee, that's awesome, is a good enough excuse to do it. But maybe I can see getting people excited about conservation again as an excuse to do it. But part of me thinks God, the amount of money it would take to do that, we could just buy so much land with that. We could just do so much sort of basic, boring, teaching people how to farm better so they don't erode their soil kind of work with that same amount of money. So it may, if I was king of the world, I might not be able to give the thumbs up for that expenditure, but luckily I'm not. And so maybe still do it anyway, and I'll get to experience the coolness that it will be if they bring those back. Because you know what, I don't, the argument that we're playing God and that we shouldn't do it because we're playing God, we have been playing God for so long, that's not even a concern. We've been in the playing God business since we invented God, so. Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm intrigued by the concept of assisted migration, but I'm envisioning an adopt a species program.
Right, right,
You can find out what cute little plant, really needs your help to move up to zone 4.
right.
I don't know who would organize that sort of thing.
Well, the who would organize it question is a really pertinent one because there's already one adopt a species group, and it's called the Toria Guardians, and they're interested in this tree. It's a yew-like tree called the Florida Toria. And the story of the Florida Toria is that it was kind of like as the glaciers move up and down and the species move around through geologic time, the last time the glaciers moved up, it got kind of trapped in this one little tiny valley on sort of the Georgia-Florida border. So it's like this range was really small. And then as the climate has been heating up, it's just been really suffering, like just not doing well in this little refugia. So this group decided, like, well, we don't want it to go extinct, we're gonna just bring it north. So they've been planting it in the Carolinas and having these big parties and naming individual trees after great conservationists. And so the scientists of the world were sort of like, oh my God, like we better get organized and start creating guidelines and decision trees for how to do this, otherwise it's just gonna be chaos. But like, I don't know if any of them have home gardens, but it's not like people haven't been moving species around, forever. There was a fantastic study in Europe showing that basically what they did is they just went to nurseries from Sweden to Italy and looked at what was for sale. And gardeners in Europe have already moved many species, like 2 or 3 zones north. There are people in Sweden who are just routinely planting things that have been native to France, stuff like that. So assisted migration is underway, sort of in a great unconscious gardening effort. It's already happening. What needs to happen if we want to be more organized about it, as you say, is for us to identify not just pretty species to move, but also ones that maybe are not so kind of horticulturally obvious contenders. But it is illegal to move species in some places, especially animals, and scientists would love it if you didn't do it without checking with them first, but they are being so slow to organize it and to figure out what to move and when to move. They keep coming up with paper after paper that just goes back to the like, hey, there's this interesting idea that we should cautiously think about maybe accepting, that I think the gardeners will do it before the scientists get around to it. What do you think? Should we do one more? And what time does the reception officially start?
In about a minute.
In about a minute. Okay, one more, and then we'll do the rest. Yes?
I was curious, thinking about your approach and your sensibilities, what about the other side of the world? Where the population is exploding.
Right, right.
And I guess I'm wondering if that an avenue you considered sort of addressing.
Well, I focus my remarks here on North America just because it's a North American audience, because I got a lot of good North American examples. The sort of non-pristineness is more striking here because we have more of a culture of thinking of the world as being pristine than in, say, Asia, Africa, Europe. But in those places, they sort of know that they're not pristine. No one in Europe thinks that. I mean, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds has a category of birds called farmland birds. And I just can't imagine the American Audubon Society assigning birds to the category of farmland birds in North America, because we're still imagining a kind of an ideal place where there's no farms, right? Like where everything goes back to whatever habitat it was in before that. So for places like Europe and Asia that are really crowded and really developed, they're kind of ahead of the curve on a lot of this stuff, and sort of integrating plants and animals into their lives, and gardens that are sort of more wild, and doing kind of more of this. But the other thing, too, is that I find the urbanization of the world to be a very positive sign. Obviously, if you get everybody together living in the cities, then all of a sudden you've got a lot more land to play with outside of the city. And that's when it becomes possible to even worry about whether to have intensive farming or biodiverse farming, when you just have the land base to start playing with those numbers. But yeah, so I mean, if the question is, do I think that we ought to be doing population reduction, then I think that we ought to be doing it, in the sort of newfangled way of educating women and waiting for that demographic transition to sort of do the work for us. So, Well, thank you guys all.